The van smelled like old coffee and gun oil, and Rennick Cataneo hated both. He sat low in the driver's seat of a battered logistics van, the kind that delivered flowers or dry cleaning, parked at the edge of a sunlit courtyard in Milan's Brera district. His jacket was a courier's jacket, cheap, faded blue, a fraying patch on the sleeve that read, "Express Line." Nobody looking at him would guess that 3 streets away, in a glass tower with his name nowhere on the deed, he controlled a shipping empire that moved more than flowers. He wasn't here for business. He was here because Ondine was here, and Ondine was the only person on Earth who could make him abandon a board meeting without a second thought. Through the windshield, he watched his sister arrange the last of her photographs against a white gallery wall that opened onto the courtyard. Black and white portraits of hands. Hands cooking, hands praying, hands signing. Ondine had been deaf since birth, and her whole artistic language had become about texture, about the things people did with their hands when words weren't an option. Today was the opening of her first solo exhibit, a modest thing, tucked into a courtyard gallery that smelled like espresso and turpentine. Rennick had wanted to stand beside her at the door. Ondine had told him, in the sharp, clear signs she used only when she meant business, that if he showed up looking like himself, like Rennick Cataneo, like a man whose name made customs officials nervous, she would never forgive him. So he'd come as no one, a courier, a shadow in a delivery van. He was 3 sips into cooling coffee when he saw the woman. She crossed the courtyard alone, weaving between wrought-iron cafe tables, carrying a leather folder stamped with an insignia Rennick didn't recognize, official-looking, embossed, the kind of folder that made his parcel tick up out of old habit. Corporate, legal, something. His hand moved without thinking, closing around the radio clipped inside his jacket. He had learned, the hard way, that people who approached his family carrying documents were rarely there for small talk. He watched her walk directly toward Ondine. He was out of the van before he'd decided to move, boots hitting cobblestone, jacket flapping open over the radio he wasn't supposed to need today. He told himself he was overreacting. He told himself Ondine's exhibit was public, that strangers came and went, that not every folder was a threat. He told himself this and kept walking anyway, cutting across the courtyard with the quiet, controlled urgency of a man who had spent a decade learning to move through crowds like smoke. 20 feet away. 15. Then the woman set her folder down on the low stone ledge beside Ondine's photographs and lifted her hands. Rennick stopped so suddenly a waiter nearly collided with him. "Hello," the woman signed, her fingers precise, unhurried, fluent in a way that came from years, not a phrasebook. "The light in your photographs is beautiful. It feels like it's breathing." Ondine's whole face changed. Rennick had seen his sister smile 1,000 times, polite smiles for gallery patrons, tired smiles for him after long days, guarded smiles for strangers who talked too loudly and too slowly at her, as if volume could fix silence. This was none of those. This smile came from somewhere underneath all of it, immediate and unguarded, the kind of smile Rennick hadn't seen on her face since their mother was alive. "You sign," Ondine's hands said back, delighted, disbelieving. "I do," the woman answered. Rennick stood frozen at the edge of the courtyard, his hand still curled uselessly around the radio, watching 2 strangers fall into an easy, laughing conversation entirely without sound. The woman's hands moved like she'd been born to it. She gestured toward one photograph, a close-up of a grandmother's knuckles kneading dough, and signed something that made Ondine laugh, a real laugh, her shoulders shaking with it. He should have walked away. There was no threat here. The folder, he realized now, wasn't legal paperwork at all. It held loose photographs, prints, notes scrawled in a restorer's careful hand. Just a woman who loved art enough to carry her own portfolio to a stranger's exhibit. But he didn't walk away. He stood there in his cheap jacket, coffee going cold in his other hand, and watched his sister talk. Really talk, hands flying, eyes bright, to someone who hadn't needed an interpreter, hadn't needed patience, hadn't needed anything except the language Ondine had spent her whole life waiting for people to bother learning. Who is she? Rennick thought. and the question surprised him with how much he wanted the answer. He didn't approach. Some instinct, the same one that had kept him alive through 2 attempted takeovers and 1 very bad winter in Marseille, told him this was not his moment to step into. Ondine had earned this small, unwitnessed joy, and he wasn't going to be the man who walked over in a courier jacket and made it about him. So he did the only thing that felt right. He turned, quietly, and drifted back toward the van, glancing once over his shoulder before he climbed in. The woman was laughing now too, her head tipped back, sunlight catching on dark hair pulled loose from its knot. She had a restorer's hands, he noticed, careful, deliberate, a faint discoloration on her fingertips that looked like old varnish, old work. Not corporate, not a threat, just a stranger who had walked into a courtyard and, without meaning to, walked straight into the middle of everything Rennick thought he understood about who was safe to let near his sister. He sat back down behind the wheel, engine idling, eyes fixed on the 2 women through the windshield glass. I need to know her name, he thought. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, the thought had nothing to do with business at all. Her name was Vespera Conti. Rennick learned this the way he learned most things now, quietly, through a single phone call to a man who owed him a favor and worked in gallery logistics. An independent art restorer, mid-30s, freelance, no criminal record, no corporate backers that raised flags. Just a woman who had spent 6 years crawling around scaffolding in half-collapsed churches, coaxing 400-year-old paint back from the edge of ruin. He told himself that was the end of it. A name, a background check, nothing more. He had a shipping empire to run and a sister who would skin him alive if she knew he'd looked the woman up at all. He did not expect to see her again by Tuesday. The freight docks sat on the industrial edge of Milan, a sprawl of corrugated warehouses and idling trucks, where Cataneo Logistics moved everything from textiles to machine parts to things Rennick preferred not to itemize in writing. Here, he was not Rennick Cataneo, feared and quietly respected across half of northern Italy's shipping lanes. Here, he was Ren, just Ren, a freight coordinator in a high-vis vest, clipboard in hand, calling out container numbers to men who had no idea their boss was standing 3 feet away from them. It was a good disguise, and not just a disguise. He liked these mornings more than he liked boardrooms. There was an honesty to freight work. A crate was either where the manifest said it was, or it wasn't. Nobody smiled at him and lied to his face down here. He was halfway through a shipment count when he heard her voice cut across the loading bay, sharp with frustration, arguing with a dock supervisor who clearly had no idea what to do with her. It was supposed to arrive Friday. It has a tracking number. I have the tracking number right here. Rennick looked up, and there she was. Vespera Conti, hair scraped back into a tighter knot than the one she'd worn at the gallery, a canvas satchel slung across her body, waving a printed shipping slip at a supervisor who was one wrong word away from radioing security. She looked exhausted, in the particular way of someone whose entire week depended on a crate nobody could locate. Rennick's pulse did something inconvenient. He set down his clipboard and crossed the floor before he'd fully decided to. "What's the problem?" The supervisor, grateful for the interruption, thrust the slip at him. "Says it's a specialty shipment. Chemical materials, fragile equipment. System's got no record of it past customs." Vespera turned to him, and for a half-second Rennick braced for recognition. The courier jacket, the courtyard, some flicker of, "I've seen you before." But her eyes only registered a man in a high-vis vest, tired and unbothered, one more anonymous face in an anonymous industry. It should have relieved him. Instead, it landed somewhere strange, a small disappointment he didn't examine too closely. "It's restoration equipment," she said, softer now, like she'd decided he might actually help. "Solvents, brushes, a UV lamp calibrated to a very specific spec. I need it in Bellagio by Thursday, or I lose a chapel commission I've been trying to land for 2 years. "Bellagio," Rennick repeated, filing the word away. "Chapel work. 16th century fresco, water damage." She said it the way other people talked about, worried, proprietary, fiercely protective. If the crate doesn't show up, the commission goes to someone else, And honestly, someone else will botch it, because nobody else has done Cinquecento plaster restoration in this region since Dario Falcone retired. Rennick pulled up the manifest system on the dock terminal, more out of habit than hope. He knew this warehouse better than the men who worked it. Crates didn't vanish here. They got misfiled, buried under the wrong customs code by an overworked clerk trying to clear a backlog. He searched under specialty imports, then chemical goods, then there. A pallet flagged under an entirely wrong client code, sitting in Bay 11 since Saturday morning. Bay 11, he said. It's here. Somebody filed it under the wrong account. Something in Vespera's shoulders dropped, relief loosening through her whole body. You're joking. I don't joke about inventory. He waved a hand, and two dock workers peeled off to retrieve the pallet. And for a moment, he just watched the crate come toward her on a forklift. Watched the way she pressed her palm flat against the wooden slats like she was checking a patient's pulse. "Thank you," she said, and meant it, and Rennick felt the words land somewhere he hadn't expected them to. "It's my job," he said, which was almost true. She glanced at the shipping schedule pinned to the wall, biting her lip. "The problem now is getting it to Como by Thursday. My van's in the shop, and courier services this last minute cost more than the commission's worth." Rennick knew with total clarity that he had no business doing what he was about to do. A syndicate head did not personally chauffeur restoration equipment across the lake for a woman he'd known for exactly 90 seconds of actual conversation. Gianni would call it reckless. His board would call it insane if they ever found out, which they wouldn't, because nobody would ever connect Ren the freight coordinator to anything worth reporting. "I can drive it up myself," he heard himself say. "I've got deliveries near Como this week anyway." Vespera studied him, not suspicious, just suspicious, the way people are surprised by unearned kindness. "You'd do that?" "Chapel's not going anywhere if the fresco falls apart first," he said, and something about the dry logic of it made her almost smile. "Thursday morning," she said. "I'll meet you at the dock. And thank you, really." She walked away toward the crate, already pulling out her phone to call the chapel and confirm the schedule, and Rennick stood there in his high-vis vest, watching her go, thinking that he had just volunteered a syndicate head's personal time to drive a stranger's varnish and brushes 2 hours north. He didn't regret it. That worried him more than anything. Thursday morning came in grey and cool, mist still clinging to the warehouse rooftops when Vespera arrived at the loading dock with 2 coffees and an apology already halfway out of her mouth. "I know this is a huge favor," she said, handing him one of the cups before he could protest. "You didn't have to say yes." "I did say yes, though." Rennick checked the crate straps one final time, making sure the UV lamp was cushioned against the van's inevitable potholes. "So there's no use apologizing for it now." She laughed, and it was a real laugh, and he decided he liked being the reason for it more than he should. The drive north unspooled slowly, flat industrial roads giving way to hills, then the first glittering edge of Lake Como appearing between cypress trees, like something out of a postcard nobody believed was real until they'd seen it themselves. Rennick drove with one hand loose on the wheel, the other resting on his knee, aware of Vespera beside him in a way that had nothing to do with the road. "Can I ask you something?" he said, an hour in. "The chapel commission, why does it matter so much? You could take easier work." Vespera was quiet for a moment, watching the water flash between the trees. "I have a younger sister, Leora. She was born deaf, like your—" She caught herself, embarrassed. "Sorry, I don't actually know if you have a sister. I just meant, like some people are. Anyway, when Leora was born, our parents didn't know sign language, didn't know how to reach her, and I watched her get quieter every year because nobody was trying hard enough to meet her halfway. So I learned, properly. Not just enough to get by, fluently, so she'd never have to feel like she was shouting into a room that couldn't hear her." Rennick's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. He thought of Ondine, at 6 years old, watching their mother's mouth move and never quite catching the shape of the words. He thought of himself at 12, refusing to eat dinner until someone taught him the alphabet in sign. Furious in the particular way, "That's why I do restoration work too, actually," Vespera continued, not noticing how still he'd gone. Old frescoes, old churches, nobody's speaking for them anymore. They're just sitting there, falling apart, waiting for someone to bother translating what they used to say. I think I've always been drawn to things that get ignored because they're difficult to understand. That's a good way to put it, Rennick said quietly, and meant it more than she could know. He did not tell her about Ondine. He wanted to. The confession sat right behind his teeth, warm and dangerous, but some old, practiced instinct held him back. Not yet. Not until you know who's asking. 40 minutes back, in a nondescript grey sedan, Gianni Moretti kept the delivery van in sight and hated every kilometre of it. Gianni had been Rennick's head of security for 11 years, had pulled him out of a car fire in Marseille, and once talked a rival syndicate out of an assassination with nothing but a phone call and a very specific list of names. He did not trust coincidences, and a restorer who'd walked straight up to Ondine at a public gallery, folder in hand, sign language fluent and ready, that was not a coincidence. That was reconnaissance. He'd pulled Vespera Conti's public records that morning. Freelance restorer, unremarkable client list, nothing that screamed corporate spy on paper. But paper lied. People who wanted access to men like Rennick didn't advertise it. They built quiet, patient covers, and a deaf sister was exactly the kind of soft entry point a smart operative would exploit. Approach the vulnerable family member first. Win trust through sympathy. Work inward. He'd seen it before. He'd buried people who hadn't seen it coming in time. Gianni thumbed his radio but didn't transmit yet, watching the van take the coastal curve ahead of him, watching how close Rennick sat to the woman, how his head turned toward her more than the road warranted. That was the part that worried him most. Not suspicion of Vespera, suspicion of Rennick. 12 years of discipline and one gallery courtyard had cracked something open in him that Gianni didn't like the look of. Watch. Don't move yet, he told himself, and kept driving. The tire blew just past the town of Menaggio, a sharp bang and a lurch that sent Vespera's coffee spilling across her knee and Rennick's hands snapping instantly to the wheel, correcting the skid with a calm precision that startled her more than the blowout itself. He pulled the van onto a gravel shoulder overlooking the water, cut the engine, and was out and around to the back before Vespera had fully processed what happened. "Are you all right?" he asked, already crouched by the flat tire, checking the crate straps through the back window with the same motion, satisfied nothing inside had shifted. "Fine, just coffee everywhere." She climbed out, watching him work the jack with quick, practiced movements, not the fumbling of a man who called roadside assistance for everything, but someone who clearly knew engines the way she knew brushes and solvents. "You're good at that?" "Freight work." He didn't look up. "You learn fast when a flat costs you the whole delivery window." She crouched beside him anyway, close enough that he caught the faint smell of turpentine still clinging to her sleeves, and handed him tools before he asked for them, correctly, without needing to be told which was which. Lake Como stretched out beside them, flat and silver under the grey morning light, mountains rising on the far shore like something ancient and patient. "Thank you," she said again, quieter this time, watching him work. "For all of this. You didn't have to." Rennick tightened the last bolt and sat back on his heels, looking at her properly. Dirt-smudged, coffee-stained hands, tired eyes, a fierceness underneath all of it that he found he couldn't look away from. "I wanted to," he said, and this time it wasn't almost true. It was simply true, and that frightened him more than any rival syndicate ever had. The villa rose out of the hillside like something remembered from a dream. Pale stone walls softened by ivy, tall shuttered windows catching the afternoon light, terraced gardens spilling down toward the lake in steps of cypress and oleander. Rennick had bought it 8 years ago under a shell company so anonymous even his own accountants had to look twice, and it remained the one property in his entire portfolio that had never once been used for business. It was Ondine's now, in every way that mattered. Her studio occupied the entire east wing, floor-to-ceiling windows angled to catch the light she chased across every photograph she made. She was already there when the van crunched up the gravel drive, sleeves rolled to the elbow, unpacking equipment crates onto long trestle tables set up beneath the loggia. She looked up at the sound of tires, and her whole face opened when she saw who was climbing out of the passenger side. "You came," Ondine signed, delight breaking across her expression as she crossed the courtyard toward Vespera. "I told you I would," Vespera signed back, already laughing, already folding into an easy hug that made something in Rennick's chest ache with a feeling he didn't have a clean name for. He busied himself unloading the crate, giving them space, though he watched from the corner of his eye as the two women fell into conversation, hands moving fast and warm between them. Ondine gestured toward the studio, inviting Vespera in to see the new prints, and Vespera's face lit with genuine curiosity, not the polite interest of someone being toured through a rich man's property, but real hunger to see the work. "Rennick," Ondine signed over her shoulder, catching him watching. "Come, bring the lamp crate. Careful with the corner, it's marked fragile." He obeyed, carrying the crate into the studio, setting it down exactly where Vespera pointed, and found himself standing at the edge of a conversation he wasn't part of, content in a way that surprised him. Ondine pulled out her laptop, propped it against a stack of portfolio boxes, and dialed a video call, her fingers flying with the particular excitement of someone introducing two people she loved. The screen blinked to life, and a younger woman's face appeared, sharp-eyed, quick-smiling, unmistakably Vespera's sister even before Ondine signed the introduction. "This is Leora," she signed to the room, though only Vespera and Rennick could hear the words that weren't there. Leora signed a greeting, fast and warm, and Ondine answered in kind, and for the next 20 minutes the studio filled with a conversation Rennick could only half follow, 3 years of Vespera teaching him nothing, and he cursed himself quietly for it, wishing he understood more than the shapes his sister's hands made when she laughed. Vespera translated occasionally, murmuring a phrase under her breath for his benefit without being asked, a small kindness that landed harder than it should have. "Leora wants to know if Ondine will teach her photography sometime," Vespera said, smiling at the screen. "She's been asking for years." "Tell her yes," Ondine signed, and spoke at once, her voice a little rough with disuse, but clear. "Tell her I'll teach her everything." Watching them, his sister, this stranger who wasn't a stranger anymore, a girl on a laptop screen 200 kilometers away, Rennick felt something shift permanently in his chest. This was not reconnaissance. This was not a corporate spy building a soft entry point into his life. This was two people who had spent their whole lives being underestimated, finding each other and refusing, for once, to be quiet about it. He wanted, badly, to tell Vespera the truth. All of it. The syndicate, the shell companies, the reason he wore a courier jacket to his own sister's gallery opening. The words sat heavy behind his teeth all afternoon, and twice he nearly let them out. And twice, something in him, old caution, older fear, pulled them back. Gianni arrived an hour after sundown, ostensibly to deliver security reports on the villa's perimeter cameras, though the reports were only half the reason he'd come. He found Rennick alone on the terrace, watching the last light drain off the lake, and set a slim folder on the stone balustrade between them without a word. "What's this?" Rennick said, though he already suspected, and the suspicion soured his stomach before Gianni even answered. Background on Conti Restoration. Her business, not just her. Gianni's voice was flat, careful, the voice he used when he already knew Rennick wouldn't like what came next. She's freelance, like the public record said, but her early grants, the ones that funded her training, her equipment, the first 3 commissions that built her reputation, all came through a single sponsor, a development fund called Meridian Capital. Rennick opened the folder. Photocopied grant applications, funding letters, a signature line at the bottom of each that made his jaw tighten. Meridian's a shell. Meridian's a shell for Corvado Holdings, Gianni said. Same commercial developer that's been sniffing around chapel and church properties across this region for the last 2 years, buying up unsafe structures cheap and flattening them for lakefront resorts. Rennick stared at the papers, the easy warmth of the evening curdling into something colder. You think she's working for them? I think it's a very convenient coincidence that a restorer funded by a developer with a history of demolishing historic churches just happened to land a commission for a chapel that developer would very much like gone. Gianni's tone stayed level, but Rennick had known him long enough to hear the warning underneath it. I'm not saying she knows. I'm saying someone above her might, and you brought her straight into the middle of your family without knowing which. Below them, through the studio's lit windows, Rennick could see Vespera and Ondine still bent over the laptop, laughing at something on the screen, utterly unaware they were being discussed like a threat assessment. Keep digging, Rennick said finally, folding the papers closed, his voice quieter than he meant it. Quietly. I don't want her to know we're looking. And if it's true? Gianni asked. If she is connected? Rennick looked out at the water, dark now, the mountains folding into shadow on the far shore, and found he did not have an answer he liked the sound of. The chapel of Santa Maria delle Grazie sat on a narrow spit of land at the edge of Bellagio, its bell tower leaning almost imperceptibly toward the lake, 400 years of damp lake air slowly working its way into every seam of plaster and stone. Vespera arrived before sunrise with her equipment cart, letting herself in through the side door with the key the parish priest had given her, and stood for a long moment in the nave, just looking up. The fresco covered the apse ceiling, a Madonna surrounded by saints, their faces softened by centuries of candle smoke and rising damp, whole sections gone grey and blistered where water had crept behind the plaster and pushed it away from the wall like skin lifting from a wound. Vespera had seen photographs of it in the commission brief, but photographs never prepared her for standing underneath 400 years of accumulated damage, knowing that if she failed here, this ceiling might not survive another decade. She set up her scaffolding platform, unpacked her tools with the reverent precision of a surgeon, and began the slow work of mapping every crack, every blister, every place where the paint had begun its quiet retreat from the wall. Rennick came by mid-morning, in his high-vis vest and work boots, carrying a crate of her supplies she hadn't asked him to bring, and she'd stopped questioning by now why a freight coordinator kept finding excuses to be wherever she was. She liked it too much to interrogate it. "How's it looking?" he asked, craning his neck up at the ceiling. "Worse than the photos," she admitted, "but not hopeless. If I can stabilize the plaster this week, I've got a real shot at saving most of it." She glanced at him, softer than she meant to. "Thank you for the crate. You keep doing that." "Habit," he said, which wasn't quite a lie and wasn't quite the truth either. They didn't get another hour before the chapel doors banged open. 3 people walked in without knocking, a woman in a tailored charcoal suit at the front, flanked by 2 men in matching corporate polos, all 3 carrying tablets like they were walking into a boardroom instead of a 400-year-old church. The woman's heels clicked sharp against the stone floor, echoing up into the damaged apse. "Vespera Conti," the woman said, not really a question. "I'm Elena Rossi, site director for Corvado Holdings. We need to speak with you about a stop work order." Vespera climbed down from her scaffolding, wiping plaster dust from her hands, confusion tightening into wariness. "There's no stop work order on this site. I have a signed agreement with the parish." "The parish doesn't own structural liability." Rossi turned her tablet around, showing a document dense with legal language. "Our engineering survey flagged this building as structurally compromised. Foundation subsidence, load-bearing risk in the bell tower. Continued work here is a liability the diocese can't legally authorize until we complete our own safety assessment." "Your engineering survey," Vespera repeated, and something hard entered her voice. "Funded by the same company trying to buy this land for a resort development. I've read about Corvado's other projects. You don't do safety assessments. You do demolition orders with better paperwork." Rossi's smile didn't move. "The building's condition speaks for itself. I'd invite you to review our findings before making accusations, Miss Conti." Rennick stood at the edge of the nave in his work boots and high-vis vest, saying nothing, watching Vespera hold her ground against a woman with a legal team behind her, and felt something old and dangerous stir in his chest. The particular fury of a man who had spent a decade learning exactly how corporate paperwork could be weaponized against people who didn't have the resources to fight it. He knew Corvado Holdings. He knew, now, with a sick certainty Gianni's folder had only half prepared him for, exactly who was funding this safety assessment, and it made the ground under him feel unsteady in a way lake winds never had.
"We'll need this site cleared by end of day," Rossi continued, sliding the tablet back into her bag. "You have 48 hours to remove your equipment before we begin our own survey work." She turned and walked out, heels clicking, her two colleagues trailing behind her, and the chapel doors banged shut, leaving Vespera standing in the dust-moted light with her hands shaking. "They can't do this," she said, more to herself than to Rennick. "I have a contract. 2 years I've been trying to land a commission like this, and they're going to bulldoze it out from under me with a fake survey." "They can't stop you if the paperwork doesn't clear," Rennick said quietly. She looked at him, something desperate in her eyes.
"It's already filed. It clears in 48 hours whether I like it or not." Rennick said nothing more, but something in his expression must have shifted, because Vespera studied him a beat too long, as if trying to place an expression she hadn't seen on the freight coordinator's face before. Something colder, more certain, entirely unlike a man who spent his days chasing lost crates. He left an hour later, claiming a delivery run, and drove not toward the docks, but toward a quiet office 2 towns over, where a lawyer he trusted with things that never appeared on paper kept an emergency line open at all hours. By nightfall, without a single phone call traced back to Cataneo Logistics, a filing clerk in the regional planning office found an irregularity in Corvado's structural survey paperwork. A missing certification, a stamp from an inspector whose license had lapsed 8 months prior. The stop work order, so close to finalizing, stalled in a queue that would take, conservatively, 48 hours to untangle. Rennick never told Vespera what he'd done. He simply arrived the next morning in his high-vis vest, carrying coffee, and told her the paperwork had hit a snag downtown, that she had her window after all. She hugged him before she thought better of it, and he stood there in the chapel light, arms around a woman who had no idea he'd just spent his night quietly dismantling a threat with the same precision he used to run an empire, and thought, not for the first time, that the lie was starting to cost more than he'd budgeted for. The 48 hours bought her a window, not a guarantee, and Vespera knew it. She worked through the day and into the evening, stabilizing what she could of the blistered plaster before whatever Inspector Corvado sent next found a reason to shut her down for good. By the time the sun dropped behind the western hills, the chapel had gone from gold to blue to a deep, candle-lit dark, and she was still on the scaffolding, mixing consolidant by lamplight, her shoulders aching in a way she'd stopped noticing hours ago. Rennick stayed. He told himself it was to guard her equipment. The solvents alone were worth more than most people's cars, easy pickings for anyone Corvado sent to make trouble in the dark. It was a reasonable excuse, and it was also, he knew, only half true. The other half was simpler and harder to admit. He didn't want to leave. "You don't have to sit there all night," Vespera called down from the platform, not looking up from the careful line of consolidant she was brushing along a hairline crack. "Somebody has to hold the flashlight," he said, which was untrue, since she'd rigged 3 battery lamps around the scaffold hours ago, but she let the excuse stand because she liked having him there too. Around midnight, she climbed down to mix a fresh batch, and they sat together on the chapel steps, her tools spread between them, the lake wind sliding in cool through the propped-open side door. She was quiet for a while, watching him in the lamplight, and then she said, almost shy about it, "Do you want to learn something?" "Learn what?" "Sign, a little. You spend so much time with Ondine, and I keep translating for you, and—" She shrugged, a little embarrassed by her own suggestion. "It would mean something to her, if you tried." Something in Rennick's chest tightened, guilt and want tangled together so thoroughly he couldn't separate them. "Show me," he said. She talked him, slowly, patiently, her hands guiding his through the shapes. The sign for sister, for thank you, for beautiful. Her fingers warm against his in the lamplight, correcting the angle of his wrist, laughing softly when he got it wrong, which was often at first.
He learned faster than she expected, and something in her expression shifted, watching him try so hard. Like she was seeing a different man than the freight coordinator who fixed flat tires and located lost crates. "You're good at this," she said. "Most people give up after the first 10 minutes. "I have a good reason to want to learn," he said, and meant it more than she understood, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. The space between them charged with something neither was brave enough to name yet. She reached for the measuring tape clipped to his jacket pocket, an old habit, taking whatever tool was closest rather than digging through her own kit, and her fingers brushed past the tape measure to something harder, angular, tucked into the inner pocket she hadn't noticed before. She pulled it free before she thought better of it. A satellite phone, not a normal one. Heavy, encrypted casing, a screen that lit up the moment her thumb grazed it, displaying a string of notifications that meant nothing to her and everything to the wrong person seeing them. Board directive, Corvado Holdings review pending, Cataneo signature required. Vespera went very still. "That's not." Rennick reached for it, too quick, too sharp, and she pulled her hand back instinctively before he could take it from her. "Cataneo," she said slowly, the name rolling over in her mouth like she was checking it against something. "That's the logistics company, the one that owns half the shipping lanes out of Milan." She looked up at him, and he watched the pieces start assembling behind her eyes, watched suspicion crack through the warmth that had been building between them all night. "Why does a freight coordinator have a board directive on his satellite phone?" "It's not what it looks like," Rennick said, and heard even as the words left him how thin and useless they sounded. "Then what does it look like?" Her voice had gone careful now, guarded, the same wariness she'd shown Elena Rossi in the chapel doorway that morning. "Because it looks like you're someone very different from who you've told me you are." He wanted to tell her everything, right there on the chapel steps, with the lake wind moving through the propped door and her hand still holding the phone like evidence. He wanted to say, "I'm not hiding this to hurt you. I'm hiding it because the moment you know, everything about how you see me changes, and I wasn't ready to lose the way you look at me now." But the words tangled somewhere behind his teeth, and what came out instead was smaller, weaker. "It's complicated," he said. "I'll explain, just not tonight, not like this." Vespera set the phone down on the step between them, carefully, like she didn't quite trust herself to hand it back to him directly. "I don't like complicated," she said quietly. "I've had complicated before. It cost me a commission I spent 2 years chasing and nearly cost me my sister's trust when I chose the wrong sponsor for her early treatment. I don't do complicated anymore." "I'm not Corvado," he said, low, urgent. "Whatever you're thinking right now, I promise you, I am not them." "Then who are you?" He didn't answer. Above them, the fresco's damaged saints watched down from the shadowed apse, half restored, half ruined, caught in the same unfinished state as everything between them, and Rennick sat there in his high-vis vest with a syndicate head's phone lying exposed on the chapel steps, and understood, with a sinking certainty, that the truth was no longer his to control the timing of. Vespera didn't sleep. She packed her equipment in silence after the chapel, and Rennick drove her back to the villa without either of them finding the words to fill the space between them, the radio off, the lake a black mirror sliding past the windows. She rose early the next morning anyway, unable to stay still with the question sitting like a stone in her chest, and walked out into the villa gardens to think, past the terraced roses and down toward the cypress-lined path that overlooked the water. She didn't expect company. She certainly didn't expect Gianni. He was waiting for her on a stone bench near the lower terrace, arms crossed, watching the mist burn off the lake with the patient stillness of a man who had learned long ago that most useful conversations start with silence. "Miss Conti," he said, standing as she approached,
Not unkindly, but not warmly either. A moment of your time? She stopped, wary. You're Rennick's, she searched for the word, colleague. Head of security, Gianni said, and watched her flinch, just slightly, at the word security attached to a man she'd believed was a freight coordinator. I think you already suspect that's the wrong title for what I actually do. I don't know what to think anymore, Vespera admitted, and hated how tired her own voice sounded. Gianni studied her for a long moment, weighing something, and then said, with the flat directness of a man who preferred honesty to strategy when strategy had already failed. I'm going to tell you something Rennick won't. He works in a world where the people around him are rarely who they claim to be, Miss Conti. Corporate rivals, board members with private agendas, women who appear at the right moment with a very useful skill and a very convenient reason to be near his sister. He let that sit. I don't know yet which one you are, but I know that everyone who gets close to him ends up in danger, whether they intend it or not. If you care about your own safety, or your sister's, I'd suggest putting distance between yourself and Rennick Cataneo. Vespera's stomach dropped at the full name, Cataneo, spoken aloud, confirmed, no longer a suspicion she could argue herself out of. Cataneo, she repeated. Rennick Cataneo, the shipping magnate. The syndicate, Gianni said, choosing not to soften it. Whatever term you prefer, it amounts to the same danger. He left her there among the roses, mist still curling low over the water, and walked back toward the villa without a backward glance, having said exactly as much as he'd intended, and not a word more. She found Rennick an hour later on the terrace, coffee untouched in front of him, watching the same water Gianni had watched with her, and she didn't wait for pleasantries. Your head of security just warned me away from you, she said. Told me you're dangerous. Told me everyone who gets close to you ends up hurt. She crossed her arms, holding herself together with the gesture. Is that true? Rennick set down the coffee cup with careful precision, buying himself a half-second he didn't really have. Some of it, he said. Not the part about you getting hurt. I'd burn down everything I've built before I let that happen. Then tell me the rest of it. All of it. No more freight coordinator, no more convenient tire blowouts and lost crates. Who are you, actually? He looked at her. Really looked. The way he hadn't let himself since the courtyard. Since he'd first realized how much he wanted her opinion of him to survive the truth. And understood there was no version of this conversation where he came out clean. My family runs Cataneo Logistics, he said slowly. Not the surface version. Not the shipping manifests and customs clearances. Underneath that, there's a network, leverage, influence, things that move through channels that don't exactly ask permission. I inherited control of it 11 years ago when my father was gone, and I've spent every year since trying to keep it from touching the two things I actually care about protecting. Ondine, and now, apparently, you. Vespera's jaw tightened. So the courtyard, the docks, the tire that just happened to blow out on the exact road I needed to travel. The tire was real, he said quickly. I didn't orchestrate any of it. I saw you sign hello to my sister and I couldn't make myself walk away. Everything after that was just me, wanting to be near you, without the weight of who I am attached to it. That's the part that scares me, she said, quieter now, some of the anger draining into something rawer, not the money. Not even the danger, exactly. It's that I don't know which version of you I've actually been falling for. The freight coordinator who fixed my tire doesn't exist. He was never real. He was real, Rennick said, and the certainty in his voice surprised even him. He's the only version of me that's ever felt real. The suits, the boardrooms, the name people flinch at, that's the mask. What you saw at the docks, on the drive, on the chapel steps, that's who I actually am when nobody's watching to see if I'm dangerous enough. Vespera didn't answer immediately. She looked out at the lake, at the mist finally clearing off the water, and Rennick watched her weigh 2 years of hard-won trust against everything Gianni had just handed her. I need time, she said finally. Not to disappear, just to think. without you standing here making it hard to think clearly. 24 hours, Rennick said.
Give me 24 hours, and I promise you I'll fix this. Not the trust, I know that's not mine to fix that fast, but the threat, Corvado. Whatever Gianni's warning you about, I'll make sure it can't touch the chapel, or you, or anything you've worked for. Then you decide what you want to do with the truth. Vespera held his gaze a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her eyes, and finally nodded, once, before turning back toward the villa and leaving him alone on the terrace with a cold coffee and 24 hours to prove he was worth the risk she hadn't yet decided to take. Rennick didn't go back to the villa. He drove straight to Milan, back into the glass tower with his name nowhere on the deed, and for the first time in months walked through the front doors as exactly who he was. The board officers sat on the 40th floor, all steel and quiet money, and Rennick bypassed his own office entirely, heading instead for the small, windowless records room where Cataneo Logistics kept its actual paper trail, the one that never touched a server, never touched an email, existed only in locked cabinets and the memory of the two people trusted to maintain it. I need everything on Corvado Holdings, he told the archivist, a wiry, silent man named Ferro, who'd worked for Rennick's father before him. Every filing, every funding source, every hand that's touched it in the last 3 years. It took 4 hours. Rennick sat at the long table with his sleeves rolled up, coffee going cold beside him for the second time that week, cross-referencing shell company registrations with the patient, methodical fury of a man untangling a knot someone else had tied deliberately tight. Meridian Capital fed into Corvado. Corvado fed into a redevelopment fund with 3 silent partners, each one buried under enough paperwork that a casual search would never connect them. The third silent partner was the one that stopped him cold. D. Salvi. Domenico Salvi, seat 6 on the Cataneo board, a man Rennick had known his entire adult life, who had sat across from him at 100 meetings, who had voted, publicly, against every expansion into unnecessary cultural liability projects, Rennick's quiet term, internally, for the small acts of preservation he funded across the region, church roofs and archive restorations, and grants nobody outside the company ever heard about. Domenico had been building a private fortune off the very things he voted against saving. Rennick sat back in his chair, the pieces settling into place with a cold, clean clarity. Salvi had funded Vespera's early grants through Meridian, not because he cared about art restoration, but because a well-credentialed, well-funded restorer made an ideal cover for identifying which historic properties were structurally vulnerable enough to condemn and redevelop later. He'd been running this pattern for years, quietly profiting off the very churches and chapels the Cataneo name was supposed to be protecting, using Rennick's own reputation as camouflage. Vespera hadn't been recruited. She'd been used, without ever knowing it. Her genuine talent and genuine love for the work turned into unwitting reconnaissance for a man she'd never met. "He's been doing this since when?" Rennick asked, voice flat and dangerous in a way that made Ferro glance up from the files. 18 months at minimum, possibly longer. Rennick closed the folder and sat very still for a moment, feeling something in his chest that wasn't quite rage. Rage would have been easier. This was colder. This was the particular fury of a man realizing the danger to the people he loved had been sitting in his own boardroom the entire time, wearing a tailored suit and calling him son at company dinners. He called an emergency board session for that evening, giving no reason beyond urgent shareholder matter, and Domenico Salvi walked into the 40th floor conference room with no idea he was walking into the end of everything he'd built. Rennick didn't waste time on theatrics. He laid the documents across the table one by one: Meridian's registration, the funding trail to Vespera's early grants, the silent partnership in Corvado's redevelopment fund, 3 separate church properties flagged and condemned over the past 2 years, using surveys Rennick now suspected were as falsified as the one filed against the Bellagio chapel. "You've been using my company's reputation to fund a demolition scheme," Rennick said, his voice level, terrifyingly calm. "Targeting the exact heritage properties I've spent a decade quietly protecting."
And you did it by manipulating an independent restorer who had no idea she was working for you. Salvi's face went through several careful transformations, denial, calculation, and finally something closer to resignation, as he understood the documents in front of him left no room to argue. It's smart business, Rennick. Those buildings are worth nothing standing. You've been sentimental about a handful of old churches, and I found a way to make money off the ones you weren't watching closely enough. You'll resign your seat tonight, Rennick said. You'll sign over your shares in Meridian and every entity connected to it, and Corvado's holding company, the parent structure funding this entire operation. I'm executing an emergency buyout, effective immediately. You can't just... I have controlling interest and a boardroom full of witnesses to what you just admitted, Rennick said. I can, and I am. By midnight, it was done. Cataneo Logistics, through a newly formed acquisition entity that would never trace back cleanly to Rennick's public name, owned Corvado Holdings outright. Salvi's resignation letter sat signed on the conference table, his board seat vacated, his shell companies dissolved into paperwork that would take lawyers months to fully untangle and would end, ultimately, with him owning nothing but the disgrace of having been caught. Rennick didn't stop there. In the same session, exhausted but not yet finished, he drafted the transfer papers himself, the Bellagio Chapel, and 2 other properties Corvado had been circling, signed permanently into a public heritage trust, beyond the reach of any future developer, any future Salvi, any future version of the threat that had nearly cost Vespera everything she'd worked for. He didn't do it for credit. He didn't do it even entirely for Vespera, though her face was the one he kept picturing as he signed each page. He did it because some quiet, stubborn part of him, the part that had learned sign language from a lamplit chapel step 3 nights ago, understood that protecting the things people quietly loved was worth more than protecting his own comfortable distance from the truth. By the time he left the tower, the sky over Milan had gone the pale grey of early morning, and he had exactly the 24 hours he'd promised, and nothing left to hide behind when they ran out. The storm came in fast, the way lake storms did in late summer. A clear morning curdling into black clouds by mid-afternoon, wind tearing whitecaps across water that had been glass still just hours before. Vespera had spent the day at the villa, trying not to think about Rennick, trying to sort through everything Gianni had told her and everything Rennick himself had admitted, and finding no clean answer waiting at the bottom of any of it. She was in the studio with Ondine, sketching restoration notes by the window, when the first crack of thunder rolled across the lake and the sky went the color of a bruise. "The chapel," she signed suddenly, standing so fast her chair scraped back. "My compounds are still in the basement storage. If the lake rises..." Ondine didn't need the rest of the sentence. She was already reaching for a jacket, signing back with the same fierce urgency. "I'm coming." They took the smaller service car, Vespera driving too fast along the coastal road while rain began hammering the windshield in sheets so thick the wipers barely kept pace. The lake, usually so serene, had turned violent, waves slapping hard against the retaining walls, water already pooling ankle-deep in the low points of the road. Rennick met them at the chapel door, soaked through, having driven back from Milan the moment the storm broke and gone straight to the one place he knew Vespera would go if the weather turned. He hadn't slept. He hadn't changed out of the suit he'd worn to strip Domenico Salvi of everything the night before, and it clung to him now, dark with rain, forgotten. "The basement!" Vespera shouted over the wind, already moving past him toward the side door. "The solvents, the consolidants. If water gets in there, it's not just my equipment, it's dangerous. Some of those compounds react badly with..." "I know," Rennick said, and followed her in without another word. The chapel's basement sat below grade, accessible by a narrow stone stair that was already, when they reached it, wet at the bottom step. A thin, dark line of water creeping in through some seam in the old foundation, spreading fast across the floor where Vespera's crates sat stacked against the far wall. "We need to move everything to the nave," Vespera said, already hauling the nearest crate onto her hip, staggering slightly under its weight. "High ground. Now, before the water reaches the shelving." Rennick didn't argue. He grabbed the next crate, heavier, awkward in his soaked dress shoes on the slick stone stairs, and hauled it up into the nave, setting it against the base of the altar steps before turning back down for another.
Ondine followed close behind, taking the smaller boxes, her eyes catching Vespera's every few trips to coordinate the rhythm of it. Down, load, up, set down, down again. 3 of them working in a wordless, desperate relay against water that was rising faster than any of them wanted to admit. The basement window blew in on the 4th trip, a sudden shattering crash of glass and wind, and water surged through in a rush that reached Rennick's knees before he could react, cold and shockingly strong, dragging at a half-empty crate of glass vials before he lunged and caught it against his chest. "Rennick!" Vespera's voice cracked with fear, watching him stagger against the current, and for one terrible second she saw exactly what it would cost her if the water took him down here. In a basement neither of them should have risked entering at all. He didn't fall. He braced against the doorframe, crate clutched hard against him, and pushed forward through the surge until he reached the stairs, Vespera's hands closing around his arm to haul him the last few steps up into the nave, both of them breathing hard, soaked to the skin, the crate of vials somehow, miraculously, intact between them. "That's the last of it," Vespera said, counting crates with shaking hands. "Everything's up. Everything's safe." Below them, through the broken window, water continued pouring into the basement, but the equipment, 2 years of Vespera's dedication, the compounds that could have poisoned the whole water table if the crates had shattered, the tools that represented everything she'd fought to keep, sat dry and stacked along the nave floor, safe under the damaged, half-restored gaze of the fresco's saints. Ondine sank onto the altar steps, exhausted, soaked, and signed something to Vespera with trembling hands that made both women laugh despite everything, a small, disbelieving release after the terror of the last 20 minutes. Vespera translated for Rennick without being asked, her voice still unsteady. "She says we make a terrible fire brigade. Too much running, not enough umbrellas." Rennick laughed too, a real laugh, water dripping from his ruined suit onto the stone floor, and Vespera looked at him then. Really looked. Past the syndicate head, past the lies of the last week, past even the freight coordinator who'd first caught her attention at the docks, and saw only a man who had waded through rising water without hesitation because something she loved was at risk of being lost. "You didn't have to come down there," she said quietly, once Ondine had wandered off to check the fresco for storm damage, giving them a moment of unspoken privacy. "You could have let us handle it, called someone, stayed dry. I wasn't going to stand on the stairs and watch you drown for a crate of solvents," Rennick said simply. "Whatever else you think of me right now, that was never a question." Vespera looked down at her own soaked, shaking hands, at the crates she'd nearly lost, at the man beside her who'd risked exactly what Gianni had warned her a dangerous man wouldn't bother risking for anyone. "I don't think I'm afraid of who you are anymore," she said slowly, testing the words as she said them. "I think I was afraid of not knowing. That's different." Outside, the storm was already beginning to ease, thunder rolling further off across the mountains, and Rennick reached for her hand, hesitant, uncertain if she'd let him, and found her fingers closing around his without hesitation at all. The storm passed overnight, and by morning the lake had settled back into its usual glassy calm, as if the whole violent hour in the chapel basement had been something only the 3 of them had dreamed. Vespera spent the following days finishing what she could of the fresco's stabilization, and Rennick spent them quietly finalizing the paperwork that would keep the chapel, and every property like it, safe for good. Neither of them spoke much about what came next. Both of them felt it coming anyway, the way you feel weather change before the sky admits it. The exhibition had been Ondine's plan long before any of this began, a proper unveiling of her tactile light portraits, hosted at the villa itself, with the terraced gardens strung in warm lantern light and the studio doors thrown open so guests could move freely between photographs and lake air. She'd invited gallery patrons from Milan, a handful of critics, the priest from the Bellagio chapel, and, at Vespera's gentle insistence, Leora,
who arrived that afternoon by train with a small overnight bag and an expression of barely contained excitement at finally meeting Ondine in person. The two of them fell into conversation within minutes, hands flying, entirely unbothered by the guests arriving around them, and Vespera watched them from across the terrace with an ache of happiness so full it nearly hurt. She hadn't seen Rennick yet. He'd disappeared that morning without explanation, and though she trusted him more than she had a week ago, some old caution still flickered whenever he vanished without warning, a habit, she suspected, neither of them would fully unlearn soon. The gardens filled slowly as evening settled in, lantern light catching on Ondine's photographs where they hung along the loggia, hands kneading dough, hands signing, hands cradling a newborn, hands pressed against glass. Guests moved from frame to frame in hushed appreciation, and Vespera found herself standing before the portrait of the grandmother's knuckles, the same photograph she'd complimented at the courtyard gallery weeks ago, the one that had started all of this without either of them realizing it yet. "It still takes my breath away," said a voice behind her, and Vespera turned to find Ondine's priest, an older man with kind eyes, nodding toward the photograph. "She has a gift for showing people what they usually miss." "She really does," Vespera agreed, and meant it more than the polite words suggested. A ripple moved through the crowd near the terrace steps, conversation dipping, then hushing entirely, and Vespera turned to see what had caused it. Rennick stood at the top of the steps. He wasn't wearing the high-vis vest or the faded courier jacket or anything she'd ever seen him in before. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit that fit him like something built specifically for this moment, and he carried himself differently too. Not the careful, folded-in posture of a freight coordinator trying not to be noticed, but the unhurried, assured bearing of a man who had spent his whole life being watched and had simply stopped hiding from it. Ondine crossed to him immediately, and even from across the terrace, Vespera could see the pride in her face, unmistakable, as her brother took her hand and led her a few steps forward, into the lantern light where the whole gathering could see them both. "Most of you know my sister as a photographer," Rennick said, his voice carrying easily across the hushed garden. "Fewer of you know me at all, and that's been intentional. My name is Rennick Cataneo. I run Cataneo Logistics, and for most of my adult life, I've kept that name as far from my sister's work as I possibly could, because I wanted her success to belong entirely to her, and not to whatever reputation follows mine." A murmur moved through the crowd, recognition, surprise, a few sharp intakes of breath from guests who clearly knew the Cataneo name and hadn't expected to find it standing in a lantern-lit garden hosting an art opening. "That's changing tonight," he continued, "because I've realized, this past week especially, that hiding the things I care about doesn't protect them. It just leaves them undefended when it matters." He glanced briefly toward Vespera, and though his voice didn't waver, something in his expression softened unmistakably. "So I'm here, fully, as myself, to say two things." He paused, letting the garden go quiet again. "First, Cataneo Logistics is establishing a permanent endowment for the preservation of regional heritage sites, beginning with the Chapel of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Bellagio, whose restoration will be fully funded through completion and beyond, under the direction of Vespera Conti, the finest restorer I've had the privilege of watching work." A ripple of applause started, warm and immediate, and Vespera felt her face heat, caught between embarrassment and a fierce, startled pride. "Second, this villa's studio wing will become a permanent gallery space for Ondina Cataneo's work, alongside a scholarship fund for deaf and hard-of-hearing artists across the region, because my sister has spent her entire life proving that the world doesn't listen carefully enough, and it's time more of it started." The applause swelled properly this time, guests turning toward Ondine, who stood glowing in the lantern light, signing her thanks to the crowd with Leora translating proudly beside her, and Vespera found she couldn't quite see through the sudden brightness in her own eyes. Rennick found her afterward, once the crowd had loosened back into conversation and canapes, drawing her gently toward the quieter edge of the terrace, where the lantern light thinned into darkness and the lake stretched out silver beyond the garden wall. "You didn't have to announce all of that," she said, still a little stunned. "The funding, my name, in front of everyone." I wanted them to know exactly who saved that chapel, he said. And I wanted you to know I'm done separating my business from the things and the people I actually care about protecting. Vespera looked at him for a long moment, the syndicate head and the freight coordinator and the man who'd waded through rising water without hesitation, all finally standing in front of her as one and the same person. No more disguises left between them. I think, she said slowly, I'd like to see what that looks like. All of it. No more hiding. No more hiding, Rennick agreed. And behind them, the lanterns burned steady against the coming dark, and somewhere in the garden, Ondine's laughter carried clear across the water. Vespera woke before the sun, the way she always did when something in her chest felt too full to let her sleep any longer, and found the villa's east balcony already occupied. Rennick stood at the railing in a plain shirt, sleeves rolled, none of last night's tailored suit anywhere in sight, watching the sky over Lake Como shift from grey to the palest gold. The water below lay perfectly still, mist lifting slowly off its surface, mountains emerging one shadowed ridge at a time as the light climbed higher. Couldn't sleep either, she said, joining him at the rail. Too much to think about. He didn't look away from the water. I keep expecting you to have changed your mind overnight, about all of it. I haven't. She wrapped her arms around herself against the cool morning air, and then, because the moment felt like it wanted honesty rather than comfort, she added, Can I tell you something? Something I probably should have said days ago. He turned to look at her properly. Anything. I knew who you were before the chapel, she said, before the satellite phone. I knew at the docks, actually, the day of the missing crate. Rennick went very still. How? Your jacket, the courier one, from the gallery. It had a torn patch on the sleeve, express line, frayed at the corner. She almost smiled at the memory now, though it hadn't felt like anything to smile about at the time. You were wearing the exact same jacket, tucked under your seat, the day you found my crate at the freight dock. I noticed it because I'd stared at that patch the whole time you were signing hello to nobody, watching Ondine and me sign hello from across the courtyard. I saw you in the van. I didn't think much of it until I saw the jacket again. You never said anything. His voice had gone careful, working through the implication. I did a little digging of my own after that. Nothing like what your security chief probably has on me, just enough to learn the name behind Cataneo Logistics, and enough to understand why a man with that much money was pretending to fix flat tires and chase lost crates for a stranger. She met his eyes. I let you keep pretending, Rennick. Not because I was testing you exactly, because I wanted to see who you'd choose to be when you thought no one could tell the difference. And every single time, the docks, the drive, the chapel, the storm, you chose kind. Even the version of you that thought he had nothing to prove to me kept choosing kind. Rennick exhaled, something in his shoulders loosening that had been tight since the moment she'd first pulled the satellite phone from his coat. So Gianni's whole investigation was probably very thorough and probably very unnecessary, she said, a small, wry smile finally breaking through. Though I understand why he ran it, I'd have done the same in his position. I spent a week terrified of the moment you'd find out, Rennick admitted, and you already knew. I already knew, she confirmed. I just needed to see if the truth would change you, or if you'd let it change how you treated me. It never did. That's the part that mattered. He reached for her hand on the railing, and she let him take it, the sun climbing higher now, gilding the water gold and pink, the whole lake waking slowly around them. I have to ask you something properly, Rennick said, not as a freight coordinator hiding behind a delivery van, as myself, whatever that turns out to mean for the rest of my life. He turned fully toward her. This, the syndicate, the board, the endowments, the name that makes strangers nervous at dinner parties, it's not going away. I can be honest about who I am now, but I can't undo what I am. If that's too much, if the weight of it is more than you want to carry, I'll understand. I'll step back. I won't make it harder than it already is. Vespera considered him for a long moment, the lake light catching in her dark hair, and then she stepped closer, close enough that he had to look down to meet her eyes.
"I don't want you to step back," she said. "I've spent my whole career restoring things everyone else decided were too damaged, too complicated, too much work to save. I know how to love something that comes with difficult history attached. I'm not scared of complicated anymore, Rennick. I told you that once, in the chapel, and I meant the opposite of what I said. I think I've just been waiting for someone worth the complication." Something shifted openly across his face. Relief, disbelief, a happiness he clearly hadn't let himself expect. He lifted his hands then, slowly, deliberately, and signed the phrase Vespera had taught him 3 nights ago in lamplight, his fingers finding the shapes with far more confidence than that first clumsy attempt. "Stay with me." Vespera's breath caught, and she signed her answer back without a second's hesitation, the motion easy and sure, a language that had started this whole story in a sunlit courtyard weeks ago, and now, impossibly, was ending it too. Yes. Behind them, the balcony door creaked open, and Ondine stepped out to join them, still half asleep, hair mussed, catching the tail end of the exchange with immediate, delighted understanding. She crossed to stand between them at the railing, looping one arm through Vespera's and the other through her brother's, and the 3 of them stood together in the climbing gold light, watching the mist finally lift entirely off Lake Como, the water below them calm and bright and endless, and for the first time in longer than any of them could remember, nothing left to hide.